Side 2 begins with Within You, Without You, George Harrison's only composition, as well as the second longest track on the album, clocking over 5 minutes. And even more so, none of the other Beatles were involved in writing or recording any instruments in this song, not even singing any backing vocals. So essentially, this is a George Harrison solo track, just barely a year and a half before his actual debut solo album, Wonderwall Music. In fact, aside from being a progression from Love You Too, George's previous attempt at Indian-style music from the Revolver album, these two could be seen as preludes, prototypes, and dress rehearsals for that eventual Wonderwall album. It just goes to show that George was just as much a genius songwriter as John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and even Ringo Starr. Featuring some predominant Indian-based instruments overdubbed together, like a sitar, tampura, dilruba, swan mandal, and some those classic kind of tableau drum things. George here sings about sharing love, achieving peace of one's own mind, and using that piece of love to potentially save the world. The music alone brings this sense of ethnicity and diversity to the whole album. In fact, one could see this as George singing as his own character / member of the Lonely Hearts Club Band, enticing the band's audience into this spiritual experience with open eyes, ears, hearts, and minds. And what a spiritual experience it sure is. And one doesn't necessarily need to take drugs in order to fully enjoy or fully understand the song as it is. Next is When I'm 64, another unique song of the Beatles that may be among my favourite of theirs, up there with the previous song as well as Nowhere Man, Eleanor Rigby, Golden Slumbers, and Got to Get You Into My Life. Heavily influenced by a bit of ragtime music and some classic English music hall style music of old period times, this tune is dominated by clarinets, chime bells, and a bit of piano too, giving it a bit of a Mary Poppins feel to it. This was in fact one of, if not the very first song that Paul himself had written, as far back as 1956, when he was nearly 14 years old. Whew. Must have taken him just over a decade to bring such a piece to musical life, or at the very least, fully perfect it. The song itself deals with hopeful romance and potential aging, with Paul asking his love interest about what they might do together as they grow together. However, Paul won't have to worry about losing his hair. I mean, just look at how he is now. Still got a head full of hair from what I can see. Anyways, this could also be seen as harsh in hindsight, since by the time Paul actually turned 64, he was just separated from his second wife, Heather Mills. And not only that, both John and George never made it to age 64. Well, at least Ringo made it past that age, and is still with his wife as far as I know. Another fun and interesting fact about the song is that when it was first recorded, it was actually at a somewhat lower key, and Paul had it pitched up just a bit in order to make himself sound younger. So next time you want to make your singing voice sound a bit more young or old, just adjust the pitch on Audacity or transpose it on Logic Pro X. After that is Lovely Rita, a somewhat back to basics song with still a bit of that whimsy and quirky psychedelia. Part of the inspiration for this came from a little encounter Paul had with a female traffic warden outside Abbey Road, who made him pay a parking ticket. And Paul soon grew a bit of an affection towards her, finding her quite kind, nice, polite, and, well, presumably anyways. In the lyrics, Paul calls Rita a meter maid, which is basically an American term for traffic wardens or parking enforcement officers. He offers to take her for a bit of tea and dinner before they head home and relax on the sofa together. It's likely that this Rita could very well be the same woman that Paul sings to in When I'm 64, having finally got together with her. Halfway through, we get greeted by a peculiar and almost raggy-type piano solo performed by, of all people, George Martin himself, producer of all the Fab Four's albums and all-around contestant for the fifth Beatle. We also had the Fab Four perform on custom handmade kazoos made out of combs and paper. Very creative, I must say. And here's an even more interesting fact about this song here. One day when the Beatles were recording and mixing this particular song, a certain new and upcoming underground rock band dropped by for a bit of a visit. And that band were the Pink Floyd. Oh yes, that Pink Floyd. They just so happened to be working on their own debut album roughly around the same time as this, which would eventually be released a few months after Sgt. Pepper. And don't you worry, we'll get back to the Floyd sometime soon enough this year. We then follow it up with Good Morning, Good Morning. Possibly the most bizarre track on this album, and that may or may not say a lot. Starting right away with the crowing of a rooster, often associated with the dawn approaching to begin the day, immediately followed by a very jaunty brass and vocals singing the title. Let me tell you, it's not exactly Gene Kelly, Mickey Rooney, or Judy Garland. Anyways, the lyrics seem to deal with the mundaneness of English life that John himself seemed to have had some dissatisfaction with. And boy, does it already feel like a strange wake-up song. In all seriousness, this song was actually inspired by, again, not by drugs, but by an advert for Kellogg's Cornflakes cereal and the little jingle it had. Yeah, I too wish I was kidding about that. And having found, watched, and listened to presumably the very same advert, yeah, I can kinda get the idea. In the way this song kind of feels like a parody of that. While that advert was meant to show us the positivities of eating breakfast and getting ready for the day, this song almost feels like a sarcastic response from someone who's just fed up and feeling detached from it all. Such feelings are reflected in the utter chaotic nature of the music and instrumentation itself. The unusual rhythms, the inconsistent time signatures, the odd pace, it's just all borderline anarchic. And that anarchic is surprisingly, or rather unsurprisingly, represented best when by the end, the music fades out as various animal sounds gradually take over, one after another, partially inspired by the then recent Beach Boys album, Pet Sounds, which itself was inspired by the Beatles album, Rubber Soul. So I guess it kinda comes full circle, really. Then with Last Cluck of a Chicken, it perfectly and seamlessly transitions into the very next and penultimate track. And with that, we then reach the reprise of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This reprise eschews the brass sections in favour of a quick-paced hard rock and roll beat and vibe, while still maintaining the same general melody of it. The club band coming together for at least one last time for a send-off, hoping that we've enjoyed the show and thanking us once again. The reprise then quickly closes out with few more sounds of the crowd audience cheering and applauding, giving us a good signal of the concert nearing its very end as it too segs into the very last song. And so Sgt. Pepper finally comes to a fantastic finale and an encore for the Lonely Hearts Club Band with A Day in the Life. And oh boy, is it a worthy finale. Over a bit of bittersweet acoustic guitar and piano, John sings about reading the news about a lucky man who had made the grades. Good thing he'd studied hard at uni. However, it soon takes a dark turn in revelation as it turns out that this so-called lucky man had his mind blown out in a car. One may assume that refers to committing suicide, but actually, it's immediately followed by he didn't notice the line had changed, meaning he was likely killed in a car crash due to not looking at the traffic lights. This was inspired by a newspaper article, seen a pattern here in all this, about a man named Tara Brown an heir to the Guinness Company and its fortunes, whose life was cut short in a similar real-life accident. And he just so happened to be a close friend to John and Paul. In the next verse, John sings about seeing a movie one day and that the English army had just won the war. This may be a reference to a very recent film he had played a role in that would be released a few months after this album, titled How I Won the War, directed by Richard Lester, who had directed the Beatles films A Hard Day's Night and Help, and would eventually go on to direct Superman 2 and Superman 3. And after he sings the famous line of, "I love to turn you on," we find ourselves falling into an intense orchestral crescendo, which sends just chills into me. Then it drops off as we get a piano again, along with the ringing of an alarm clock as Paul's vocals kick in, singing about waking up from bed, finding out he's late, and heading off. This section alone has a bit of that McCartney quirk to it. It's almost like a spiritual prequel to Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, especially with the use of sections and some classical influence. After Paul's bit, we get more of that bombastic orchestra playing off their stuff, brass and everything, before we return to another verse of John's, this one about 4,000 holes in the roads of Blackburn, Lancashire. This too was inspired by an article on the very same newspaper as the one involving Tara Brown, this one about the large number of potholes infesting that very same town at the time. And I do repeat, potholes, not potheads. Okay? Okay. And then after one last sing of that "Turn You On" line, the orchestra performs another crescendo, just as intense and thunderous, if not slightly more so than the previous. And just as it just reaches its peak and just comes to a grinding halt, we barely get a second of near silence before we get possibly the most iconic final chord in any song in musical history. John, Paul, Ringo, and Roddy Mal Evans, each with a piano, as well as George Martin on a harmonium, striking together that famous E major chord. This chord stretches on for about 40 seconds, ringing and vibrating on as it gradually fades down on its own. You can even hear a bit of chairs creaking and papers rustling if you put your volume on the highest it could go. Their fingers must have ached from holding it down that long. Oof. And just when you're about to think that it has finished and completed right then and there, we suddenly hear a weird frequency tone of about 15 kilohertz, or at least your pet dogs will, and a sudden and shocking noise of endless looping radio chatter, presumably a high-pitched Paul saying, "Never could be any other way." And it just goes on and on relentlessly, enough to drive anyone crazy from such a last note nightmare, especially if you leave it playing on your turntable. Unless your turntable has an automated stop option of its own, then you're mostly relieved. And apparently, that whole song alone took about a total of 34 hours to record, produce, mix together, perfect, and finish at last, with all the multiple takes and everything. To give you an idea of how mad that is, the Beatles' debut album, Please Please Me, took nearly 16 hours to record in its entirety. That alone is impressively insane and insanely impressive. And with all that said and done, this album is just fantastic. I know so many people have said similarly before, but you can definitely count me in on this. I also know plenty of people also may prefer some of their other albums before or after this, like Revolver, Rubber Soul, Abbey Road, and The White Album for instance, and I praise all those albums too, but I think Sgt. Pepper here stands head to head with all that. It still holds up after 55 years, and I guarantee you it'll hold up another 55 more in the future. If you haven't listened to this entire album before, do please check it out for yourself in any way you can. If you could find it on CD, vinyl, or streaming, or wherever else, do check it out for yourself. If you have already, what are your thoughts? Do you think it deserves all the praise and the market is left on modern music as a whole? Or do you prefer another Beatles album just a little bit more? Feel free to comment down below. Next time, we begin the Summer of Love with the last album from Roxy Music.